Check one, check two.
Quick question. Including questions. Good. That's what I was thinking. I do. Nope, I'm not going to. That's my calculation about Friday afternoon lecture.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the Architect's Grey Spirit. Welcome, Friday afternoon presentation. I'm John Haig, Chair of the Architecture Department, and very excited to introduce an old friend from our days back in the South Bend, Indiana, around the University of Notre Dame. I'm going to introduce to you Philip Nielsen, a classically trained architectural designer, experienced project manager. This says 14 years, but how many now is it? Well, 17. We're up to 17, yeah. It's amazing how those just keep going. 17 years of leadership in architecture, education, interdisciplinary research. His work focuses on creating enduring spaces that serve human needs, especially in sacred, educational, and healthcare settings. From watercolor renderings to construction oversight, Philip brings a rare blend of handcraft, clarity, and client-centered leadership to every project. He studied architecture at the University of Notre Dame, where he was formed in traditional design, and he went on to pursue doctoral research at Texas A&M in campus planning, sustainability, and evidence-based design. Along the way, he taught Revit and BIM, led academic and nonprofit institutions, and worked on sacred and classical architecture with some of the country's leading designers. Philip recently joined architect and fellow Notre Dame alumnus Joel Moore's firm called Rock Substance in Dallas. Philip remains interested in projects that blend classical principles with modern function, including work on schools, churches, healing environments, and community buildings designed with beauty and care. He believes that architecture should support the human person, enrich daily life, and endure across generations. He is LEED accredited, that is, the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, which is a green building certification system developed by the United States Green Building Council. He's also certified in health environments design. He travels here today from Waco, Texas, to present to us on the necessity of a liberal arts education for creating true, real architecture, and why that type of art education, the only type of education really, is not a nice to have, but a must have for anyone who will attempt to embark on the awesome life's sacrifice of reinvigorating our culture. Please help me welcome the fortunate father of 7, Philip Nielsen.
Yes, I have time.
Okay.
Okay, this is, do I need this? I probably need this. So this topic of classical education and classical architecture comes out of the fact that before and after studying classical architecture, I've also worked on the field of classical education. And it's interesting, but what I noticed that is within both fields, there is a debate that you might not even know about what the meaning of each field is. And actually, the two debates mirror each other. They're kind of the same debate in some ways. So I wanted to start off with a quote from C.S. Lewis. He said, "Words die, and a skillful doctor of words will pronounce the disease to be mortal at the moment when the word in question starts to harbor the adjectival parasite real or true. As old horses go to the knacker's yard or old ships to the breakers, so words in their last decay go to swell the enormous list of synonyms for good and bad." Now, what he's saying there is that words that have very precise meanings often get looser and looser meanings. So a lot of people, when they talk about classical education, over time they just mean, oh, that's good education or rigorous education or something like that. And a lot of people, when they talk about classical architecture, they just mean something like traditional architecture. And so I want to look at, in both cases, the debates about what the possible meanings of the word classical are. So we'll start with, I can start with either one actually, but we'll start with classical education. The first thing is, a lot of you probably went to schools that call themselves classical, and there are programs that call itself classical education programs. And at the and the first definition that people propose is something like the great books. There was a great books movement, and it's basically studying the great ideas of the history of the world. This was associated with different people, the University of Chicago and things like that. The second, which was more a movement that it was more in the 90s and early 2000s, is it really started with a lot of the little Protestant schools that called themselves classical schools, and it comes out of Dorothy Sayers' essay. And then in that kind of family of what is classical education, it's something like, well, we study the liberal arts, where grammar you study when you're a little kid, and then logic and rhetoric, progression. That's the second definition. A lot of classical schools that have been around for 20 years will understand themselves that way. Now, when I was an undergrad is when there first started to be a pushback against that definition, and it did largely come from a lot of the Catholic educators. Jason? Hello, I hadn't seen you, and I just saw you in the back. I knew Jason, when did I last see you, 20 years ago? Probably? Okay. So, that just made me happy, though. There started to be pushback against that second definition because it was leaving out an important component, which was specifically study of Greek and Latin in the original languages. And if you go back, someone like C.S. Lewis, who I use as the person that has like the rigorous view of what is classical education. He would have said classical education is study of Greek and Latin, and that those other things may be byproducts of it, but that's not really the core definition of classical education. So just take that kind of little history of that and set it aside. Now we go to classical architecture. What is classical architecture? Well, you might not know this because my guess is some of the wrong definitions in classical architecture are not ones that you've been exposed to a lot. But the first definition of classical architecture, which is associated with someone like a Greek architect and philosopher, Dimitri Porphyros, he said classical architecture is tectonic architecture. So that's what he specifically proposed. And what he meant, I don't know if you've come across the term tectonics before. What he meant is architecture in which literally the weight of the structure is articulated in the architecture itself. This is in classical architecture. You can think like a cornice or something like that that's at the top of the structure. Looks like it has no weight on it, right? Like at the edge of your building, it usually has like this kind of shape. At the bottom of the building, for example, like under the column, you've got squashed-looking forms, right? They're actually, the weight is expressed in the building. What is more, the columns start at the top. Like if you superimpose columns one on top of the other, they diminish as they go down, so that you can see where the weight goes. If you have an arch, like in classical architecture, we see exactly where the weight goes. Now, the interesting thing about this definition is Dimitri Porphyros and the people in his camp would have said that Gothic architecture is classical. Like they would literally say that. Because the flying buttress, you can see how all the weight is carried down, to the ground. So tectonic architecture is their definition of classical. Okay, so it's for someone who wasn't taught that, it sounds like a little nuts to call Gothic architecture classical. But it's a prevalent, it's so prevalent, it's actually the first definition that I was told at Notre Dame of classical architecture. That's Richard Economachus, was a Dimitri Porphyros person, and he followed that definition. The next definition of what is classical architecture is a little vaguer, and it's something like, well, it's a language of forms that we study that are passed down. That's a lot of classical architects have used something like this as a definition. The urban designer Leon Krier is a famous example of someone who would have used that definition. The third definition, though, is one that I actually first encountered after kind of probably 2 years of this debate. I finally read Thomas's book, and he says classical architecture is architecture that studies Greek and Roman columns. And like that's classical architecture, and it immediately struck me how similar that was to Lewis's definition of classical education. So there's other things that come from the study of classical architecture, but the rigorous definition in both cases is studying Greek and Roman stuff. And all the other things are in kind of diluting the definition. So I'm going to hold to both what I would call the rigorous definitions, to Lewis and Thomas Gordon Smith's definition. Quinlan Terry and some of Robert Adam also kind of line up with the orders of architecture, studying the Greek and Roman orders. So by that definition, Gothic architecture is definitely not classical architecture. It might inherit certain things. Romanesque architecture is sometimes classical architecture, and more often it's classically, but it's beginning to not be classical architecture. There are definitely Romanesque buildings that would fit classical architecture by that, but as a rule, it's starting to get away from classical architecture. So then, there's two questions that that naturally come out of it. The first one is, well, in studying classical architecture or getting classical education, what habits do we form? Why do we study those? What habits do we form that are sort of byproducts of classical architecture? So one thing that classical architecture and classical education have in common is the concept of few things well. If you study a language in translation, you go really, really slowly, word by word, getting the meaning of it and finding out what the original author meant. It teaches a level of meticulousness. It teaches you to really understand what the original author meant in a way that other processes, can't. This is also true of studying classical architecture. If you're studying columns, and Greek and Roman architectural forms are very limited. The genius of Greek architecture is that, talk about few things well, the story of the Parthenon is the quintessential story of doing few things well, right? Like it was destroyed. They took 80 years to figure out what they were going to build there. Then they built the same thing as they'd been building before, just better and more carefully, right? So when we study in classical architecture, when we study the columns and the orders over and over and over again, we're doing something that's exactly the same as translation, in that it's forcing us to slow down and to figure out, to figure out a level of detail and precision and proportion and beauty that, like, people, when you get out into firms, we don't have time to do anymore. So it has to be ingrained, right? You have to pick up, that's why taking the time now in architecture school is so important. It also, I have a quote from John Henry Newman. It was Saint John Henry Newman. It was his feast day yesterday, actually. He wrote, "Every sensible tutor will maintain a little but well. Get one thing well before you try a second. Try to ascertain what your word means to commit it to, and to commit it to faithful memory." And C.S. Lewis said, "No one has time to do more than a very few things well before he is 20. When we force a boy to be a mediocrity in a dozen subjects, we destroy his standards, perhaps for life." So that's why we study classical architecture and not, like, I'm sure in your architecture history classes you study Gothic architecture, right? But Gothic architecture has a different logic, right? You've probably heard this before, but classical architecture is, the logic of it is wood architecture, like a temple that's built out of wood and then turned into stone. So it's all these wood forms, and they're pieced together as if they were wood and then carved into stone. Japanese architecture is wood architecture that's kept as wood architecture. And Gothic architecture is stone architecture. So the surrounding around a door, if it's Gothic, tends to be carved out of stone. It has a carved out quality as opposed to an add-on quality. So the very logic of those two different kinds of architecture, like, they have a lot in common, but they're very different. It's good to not study Gothic architecture as deeply as you study classical architecture. That's what I'm arguing for. Because you're developed, not because Gothic architecture isn't, in some sense, every bit as good. And in fact, there's a strong argument to be made that the best buildings in the world are Gothic cathedrals. However, if you went and tried to study a little bit of Japanese architecture and a little bit of Gothic architecture and a little bit of classical architecture, you wouldn't grasp any of it well enough to ever have standards. So it is true that the best Gothic architects over the last 100 years have tended to be classically trained architects. And there is something true, like the reason in classical education studying Latin is so important, or Greek. It's not like you could just study any language. Those are very logical languages with very developed grammars, like classical architecture. So they're very rational. So you can learn the principles really well through them. There's another thing that classical education in general and classical architecture have in common, and that is the act of translation itself. Architects, classical architects or traditional architects will understand this, where what we should be doing most of the time when we're doing architecture is something like translation. We take the beautiful forms and the beautiful buildings that we know, that we call them precedents, right? We study, we pin up the precedents above our desks, we look at them, we know this works, and then we adapt it to our particular situation. Sometimes the adaptation is extreme, like sometimes there's a big change. So Palladio's Villa Rotunda was like essentially a party house in northern Italy, in the Veneto, and it's just essentially like the box with the dome on it. When it was translated by English architects into England, they lifted up the dome and they put more windows around it. Or when it was translated into Monticello by Jefferson, it became more of a one-story house kind of thing, or a two-story house. But that's actually an act of translation, because you're trying really hard to understand the original and then to adapt it, rather than just go out and like an act of self-creation. This is a funny parallel, but in classical education, there's a thing that Lewis says a lot, which is the highest cannot stand without the lowest. This is literally true in architecture, but it's literally true in the sense also that you have to get fundamentals down. In classical education, it's grammar, but in architecture, it's really the basics. Like the columns really are the fundamentals. How something stands up, how it relates to the weight that goes down, and when you look at it, the massing. That all starts with columns. You can remove the columns from a house, but you can still use everything that you learned about proportion from the column to order the house, right? So that's the principle in classical education, or in education, the highest cannot stand without the lowest. There's also a thing that both these fields have in common, in that they're not curriculum-driven fields. In both fields, if you're translating something, especially children that are learning through translation, they need a tutor. They need somebody that is helping them. In architecture is a field in which you really need a teacher that you go alongside. Because in both cases, in architecture, you're developing an eye for something, and in translation of language, you're developing an ear. In both cases, it's very hard for someone to be an autodidact and to just learn that from a book, right? So the principle of classical education that goes with that is a man cannot give what he doesn't have. So this means that if your teachers don't know Latin, if your teachers don't know Shakespeare, they're not going to be able to teach you Shakespeare. If your teachers do not know classical architecture, then you're going to have a hard time learning classical architecture. And in fact, the field of classical architecture largely went away in the United States and in a large part of the world. And recovering it has taken generations, because it takes people that taught it to themselves, and then they taught it to people who then taught it to the next generation, and a lot of it's revived. This happened also actually in the period of the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, when they recovered a lot of the principles of classical architecture, it wasn't the first generation to know how to do it in a really sophisticated way. They thought about it, they taught it to people, and the next generation came along and learned to be much more comfortable with it. And honestly, the Baroque architects were the most comfortable with a lot of the forms. Let's see. So that's the idea. You cannot give what you do not have. The next question that I think is interesting with respect to classical architecture is the field of the liberal arts. So I mentioned, in dismissing what is classical education, I mentioned the liberal arts. Now, I don't know if you guys have heard what a liberal art is. So we can basically divide the things that we learn into three types of things. Fourth, prayer is sort of a fourth, but prayer is definitely a fourth. But in the realm of the world, we have servile arts, or like practical trades, and this is everything from learning to do bricklaying, to being a doctor, to being a lawyer. These are very like practical things, and you study them to accomplish something. The second thing is called a liberal art, and you study a liberal art because in studying it, it's good for you. So it enhances, improves the person that studies it. It's not for something. It's just salutary. It's good in and of itself to study. The third kind of thing, and people talk about this a lot less, the third kind of thing is what's called an art of the beautiful. An art of the beautiful, and traditionally the arts of the beautiful are dance, drawing, music, architecture, and poetry. Those are the arts of the beautiful. And the reason you produce those things is to make something beautiful. Okay, so now I've described those three things. Which does architecture fall under? Well, you know I just said it's one of the arts of the beautiful. We also know it's one of the practical arts, right? It's interesting, so there are 7 liberal arts, right? There's grammar, logic, rhetoric, the 3, like studying of words, and then there's 4 that are math, science, or the geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. So the 4 that are more mathematical. Actually, architecture, so early on, the Greeks contemplated adding 2 more. It wasn't like they just had 7 right away. The other 2 that were most commonly debated were drawing, that learning to draw is inherently a liberal art, and actually medicine. Now, medicine in that context is studied more as like the theory of what it is to be a human being, right? That would be a good thing to study. But so in that sense, there's this idea that learning to draw is good for you in and of itself. This is true. It's good for you in the same sense that learning music is good for you. It forms your sense of harmony and proportion. Like those are just good for the human being. So in that sense, the study of architecture is a liberal art that's close to the 7 liberal arts. It's actually very close in the sense, too, that when people study the 7 liberal arts, one thing that comes up is that math should be beautiful. A lot of people have a hard time seeing that. Most of my math classes that I took through my life, I didn't think how beautiful. I mostly thought it was pretty boring. But actually, the people that understand best how math can be beautiful, I would say, are musicians and architects. Because we all know how geometry can be beautiful, right? And how proportion matters, and how ultimately it's a path to God. Because that's the last thing that I wanted to say. So to summarize that section, I would say that architecture is unique, or nearly unique, and that it's a liberal art, a servile art, and an art of the beautiful. Certainly, architecture history, art history, is a liberal art. Like it's good just to study it. But actually, the studying of the craft is also a liberal art. Now, one reason, then there's also, so that's kind of that's the topic of liberal art, and that's the topic of classical education. The last thing is we talk about Greek and Roman, right? But we're a Catholic. We're Catholics. This is a Christian school, right? So it's not like we're pagan Greeks and Romans. So why is classical education and classical architecture is something that's very appropriate in a Christian society or a Christian setting. And that also goes back to, I think that in some sense they're very profoundly, the study of them is very profoundly Christian. And not in the technical sense of studying Christ, but in the sense that when we think about Christ on earth and his life, and we think about the greatest things that actually, the two greatest acts that human beings have done from the Catholic faith are Christ's acceptance of being sent to earth and his acceptance of his cross, right? And the other one is Mary's fiat, right? Like Mary's acceptance. In both cases, God was giving something, and the Christian duty in these two actions was an act of receptivity. When we study architecture, when you think about the process of it, what we're really going out and training your eye to draw, to see what is there, is really an act of receptivity. Translation of languages or something like that is really an act of receptivity. If you go out into other architecture schools, almost every other architecture school in the world, I mean literally almost every other architecture school in the world, they will tell you that architecture is not an act of receptivity. They will say it is an act of self-assertion, right? You are creating something out of your own brain, and you don't have to serve the tradition, and in fact, you should reject the tradition that's come before you. And in fact, what they're teaching is that art is something like when Lucifer, the I will not serve that Lucifer said to God. That is the philosophy of art and certainly of architecture in almost every other place, in every architecture school. Not in every architecture firm, that's not how everybody views it, but in the academic world of architecture, that's how architecture is viewed. Then lastly, there's a way, there's musings on these different topics, but there's one other thing that is interesting about architecture, and I would say it's probably, maybe poetry is the closest in the other fields of classical education, is that there's a distinction made in what we want to build. There's a distinction that's made between the idol and the icon. So if you go into, the idea is this: if you go and you see a building that's created for you to focus on the glory of the architect or the builder or the building, what the designer wants you to do is to view it and to stop, right? And a lot of the art is created specifically to get you to stop. If you look at the great works of architecture or art, sculpture, by the great Christian artists, that's not the goal. The goal is to get you, this is especially true in churches, but it could even be true in domestic architecture. The goal is to get you to see past the thing, not because the thing isn't good, but to see the thing and to focus and then to think of God. And that's why it's called an icon. And there is a difference. The first is an idol, and the second is an icon. So when we think that architecture, like the act of architecture and the philosophy of architecture is very important in how you study it, because God has given us this great gift of this beautiful world, and architecture is helping people see that, if it's right. It's helping people see that the world is beautiful. It's helping people helping people calm down so that they can hear God. It helps people to lift up their eyes to heaven. And so in that sense, architecture was always seen as something deeply integrated into the Catholic worldview. And it's not just like, oh, our friends are going to go and get majors in theology or literature or something like that, and we're doing a secular field. Think of it as it's because it's so tied to what the human being is. It's really tied to what the Catholic view of the world is, as well as education. That's the main thrust of my argument. I'm welcome questions.
Try to get this microphone around to you to answer questions, although you have to see you.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you for your talk. And so as someone who, I don't know if that's, okay. So as someone who has gone to a very classical Christian school, very big emphasis on Latin as sort of the main subject that embodies classical education, how would you say that that kind of education would make you a better architect when it's paired with the kind of classical education you would get at a place like Benedictine?
Yeah, probably first and foremost, that idea of learning few things well is really important. At the most granular level of like I do house architecture in Dallas. At the most granular level, a lot of the people that work on houses in Dallas, there isn't really a distinctive architectural style. So we've got all sorts of, you got Tudor houses, you got Spanish Revival houses, and every single one of those takes a lot of understanding that you need to really carefully understand its own kind of rules and forms and everything like that. The major failing of architects that work in those different styles is overwhelmingly like a superficial knowledge of that style. And I think that comes from their education, where they think, oh yeah, I studied this, I know it well enough. So that's what I was saying, like actually, if you study classical architecture really, really well, it's kind of what Lewis said, it creates standards for you. If you have a class of education and you study your subjects really, really well, it creates a standards. And it's really bad in education to study a lot of things at a really shallow level. And it's a huge affliction to architecture in the United States. It may be the number one affliction, along with that sort of attitude of my goal in architecture is to assert myself. Those two things combined make it so that our architecture is so bad. Does that answer your question?
Thank you for your talk. So you mentioned this also throughout the talk and then also in the question that you just answered, where you're saying that you have to understand classical architecture before you go on to understand any of these other sorts of architecture. Is that what I'm understanding that correctly? Or at what point can you start with the Gothic?
Yeah.
Or when should you transition from classical to Gothic?
I probably should have clarified this. Yeah, so you could get this is in classical education, someone could say, could you not study Greek and Latin and get a great education? Learn few things well. The answer is yes. You could go to a school that studied primarily Shakespeare, and you went really, really carefully through Shakespeare. There was no Greek and Latin, and you studied line by line, and you developed a lot of those same skills. You get a lot of the same habits that you get from getting a classical education. In China, you would have studied like ancient Chinese, things, right? Could you become a great architect if you started off studying Gothic architecture or Japanese architecture and mastered that at a probably could. That would probably be the second best thing to studying classical architecture first. The reason it's the second best thing and not just as good is because Greek and Latin, but also classical architecture have a teachable reasonableness to them. So they're more learnable. If you started off by just studying tons of Gothic architecture and tried to translate to classical, it would be harder because it's less. There are less learnable rules, and it's harder to take the first steps. And there's a lot more regional diversity and things like that. So I would say you could start with a non-classical education and get a lot of these same virtues and still move on. But there's something especially appropriate about classical architecture, or those classical languages.
With the act of receptivity that you mentioned, you also went to architecture school, and so we only have 4 years for the architecture students here, and you know that we have to take other classes as well that take up time. So I was just curious if you had advice or any stories about how you were able to invest your time into the reception of these classical things.
Yeah, so you're building habits, right? So you're building habits, and one of the biggest habits that you have is that habit of studying precedents. Like, this is a big architectural habit. That never should go away, right? Like, if we're working on whether it's a church or a house or a school, the first step for your entire architectural career is to go and to find the really good buildings that are closest to, having the same program and needs and everything else, and dealing with the same climate and all that kind of stuff, and starting with that. And not being, if you understand architecture as something that is closer to receptivity than self-assertion, you're not going to be afraid to go and find a really good school and say, well, I have to build a school in Kansas. Well, I know this really good school that's in Virginia. Let's start off by doing exactly the same thing as that school, understanding it in detail, and make modifications as we need to as we go along. You'll wind up with a very different school. You'll find you will. But that's starting with the assumption. It's an assumption of humility, right? Like, you start, the grounding point is you start with humility, and that, like, I don't know how to do this as well as this precedent that I found, and then you go from there. I'm sure that people can get to the point where they don't need to study a lot of precedent before they start a building. I'm definitely not to that point yet, and that's more like a mastery, like a judge level, 60-year-old that's, mastered all of it. Even then, they're probably, like, referring back to their books and their pictures and everything else. So that's what like, that part of it does not end with architecture school, so you're safe.
Sir, I'd like to thank you for the talk. I like to tell the students, in 4 years, you may get 1 or 2 talks like this. There's talks that introduce you to a higher level of complexity, but then there's talks that bring you to a higher level of simplicity. And this was one of them, and it's not easy to do. My question is, if classical architecture is architecture for the human being, right? It would also be true that it's architecture from the human being. And so we spoke about receptivity and we spoke about humility. Could we combine those into say the fundamental attitude is an attitude of reverence? Because there's a reverence and respect for precedent, for tradition, for the place where the project is happening,
Yes.
for the materials, for the forms, for the people who will inhabit it, for the generations that will enjoy that. Because I see that as the fundamental attitude of a creature.
Right.
Whereas the self-assertion attitude is the fundamental attitude of someone who thinks he's a god.
Yes. Absolutely. The starting point is reverence and humility, right? Like humility that ties into that reverence. And you're humble because you're not God, because you're a creature. it is the difference between the Christian worldview and the secular worldview at its very core. It just so happens that that difference between those who know that we are creatures and should be grateful about it, that difference between, like even I mentioned Lucifer, one of the legends or one of the stories is that Lucifer claims that he created himself, right? Because he denies his creatureness. That contrast between Mary and Lucifer is the exact same contrast that exists between Benedictine's architecture school and that of Texas A&M, where I also was involved in studios. That's a crazy thing to say in one sense, and the Texas A&M would not appreciate it. But their philosophy
Considering
is
one of those is stepping on the head of the other one.
yeah, that's true. But the fundamental philosophy about the art that's in the core of the studios I pick on Texas A&M, but it's every studio in the country, is one of self-assertion. As like what you need to do is assert yourself, and that's the opposite of what we as Christians are trying to do.
Vitruvius talks about the necessity of the architect to be well learned in all the subjects. So can you relate that to what C.S. Lewis was talking about being good at just a few things?
Yeah, so the liberal arts are about being well-rounded. So your education doesn't stop after you become good at one thing. And in architecture, the more things you know about everything, it will help you be better architects. So being really widely read is a really good thing that'll make you better architects. I think Lewis's point is simply that, and John Henry Newman goes into great detail about this, that bad students are ones that know a lot of different things, a little bit about a lot of different things. There's almost not, those students will never be good at not just at like professional fields, but at reasoning, because you need to slow down and do it carefully. I mean, I was talking to students about, this is how we're shadowing, and like, let's think about it. Where do back shadows go, or secondary shadows? Like really minute things that honestly, when you get out and you're doing renderings at architecture firms, you don't have a lot of time to go into nearly this much detail. But it's really important because you're learning what the standards are. So does that help?
Hey, can you help just a poor literature guy who doesn't understand anything, doesn't know anything? What is the motivation, or what is the reasoning behind preferring classical architecture over other forms of architecture? This is something that's really bothered me. That in the pre-modern world, when you believe that the planets are spaced out at harmonic intervals, which recapitulate Pythagorean chords, and you have a complete justification. You're just sort of copying nature. You're creating microcosmic. A temple is a microcosmic image of the whole temple, so you can, retune the ear. That makes so much sense, right? And when I read old literature, I feel a deep sense of nostalgia that I can't believe those things anymore. Why shouldn't we be more like Rem Koolhaas or Frank Gehry, whose works I think sort of reflect the cosmos we actually live in, right? The sort of the cosmos of the Big Bang, right? Yeah, black holes and spiral nebulae.
Okay,
Shouldn't we kind of update?
Okay. You said it bothers you. You're going to bother me. Okay, so I didn't say that classical architecture is better than other forms of architecture. So I don't believe that classical architecture is better than, say, Gothic architecture. In some ways, in a lot of ways, I like Gothic architecture the most. I mean, I mentioned that Chartres Cathedral is probably my favorite building. I said I believe classical architecture is the best thing to teach. So that doesn't necessarily mean So that's the first thing. That it's a really good starting point. I don't necessarily, one doesn't have to believe the Greek and Latin are the best languages, but Latin's a really good language to teach people because it has a logic to it. Because the Romans were very rational and systematic and careful and did things that can be repeatable and learned, right? So I won't say that classical art, you don't have to. It's perfectly okay to say classical architecture is the best form of architecture and what we love most. I've known lots of good classical architects that 100% believe that. Some may say, well, the Baroque is the high point, but it's okay to say Gothic architecture is your favorite. The second half of your question is silly because they're not reflecting like Gothic architecture. You could argue that Gothic architecture, with its complexity and it's not in patterns, right, and it doesn't have the sort of artificial rigor of classical architecture. Columns lined up are more like what we used to think the solar system is like. But I think Gothic architecture is much more like what the universe is really like than Rem Koolhaas, because they've gone back to an artificial simplicity, to a reason. Craig Gehry, the crumpled paper look, is just that's not based on a universe that believes that is reasonable. Like the universe is reasonable.
But if I said Sagrada Familia, you'd be more comfortable with that, Gaudi?
Gaudi's a hard case. So Gaudi was trained as a classical architect, and then he became more expressionistic in his architecture. Then he moved towards Catholicism and really got into Gothic architecture, which were his primary precedents with Sagrada Familia. And then Sagrada Familia he didn't finish, and an anarchist blew up his drawings. So some of Sagrada Familia is Gaudi, some of it's wonderful, some of it is not, and like I think that the crucifixion, there's one whole facade that was done by an artist that rejected Gaudi essentially. So that's a very hard example. But good Gaudi is pretty great.
Well, we can't wait for the YouTube short or TikTok version of this talk. So we don't have to ponder it too deeply.
I'll do an interpretive dance.
Thank you. Before we head over to Bishop Finkhall for the reception, please give Phil Nielsen